Let me introduce myself. My name is Rhonda Skaggs. I'm a professor in the Agricultural Economics and Ag Business Department here in the College of Ag across the street. I work with Dr. Samani, with Dr. King, and I'm a social scientist that works well with engineers sometimes better than others. Anyway, I have been asked by Dr. Samani to present some research results and add to the seminar today about some work that we have been doing together for several years. This is many people have collaborated in this research. My name's on there first simply because I'm giving this presentation. But I am bringing the social scientists or the economics angle to some of the engineering research that they have been doing. That's Dr. Samani, Dr. Bawazir in the Civil Engineering Department. Max Bleiweiss is a data guru, a physicist, a remote sensing data guy in the College of Ag. Then we have Yen Tran, who is the same student who works with Dr. Samani on this cool iPad program, which you will see with respect to irrigation scheduling, and another graduate student named Aldo Pinon. But Dr. Samani and this team has been working on remote sensing issues and remote sensing technology in irrigation as well as riparian vegetation for several years. And he flipped a slide up there, which we'll look at a similar slide here in just a second. And what I've done and some of the work that I have been doing as part of this team is carrying some of this remotely sensed data and information and trying to look at and understand some of the policy implications, the economic implications of the engineering data. So here we go. I focus on pecans here, but I can also say a little bit about some other crops as well as we get into this. But we have been addressing what we're trying to call under the heading of, so we're learning more about what water does in these crops here that we produce locally. Well, what are the economic implications? Like, what is the relationship between the water and how much crop that we're getting at the end of the growing season? So measurements and policy implications. So basically, here's some of the background questions that we have here. A lot of competition for water. I don't need to tell you all that. We're dealing with adjudication issues, transfers. The urban areas are growing. There are new demands, new claims on the water resource continuously throughout our state, throughout the entire region. It's often assumed that agricultural irrigation wastes water, right? You hear that very typically. If those farmers would just get with the program, quit using those old irrigation methods that their great-great-great-great-grandpas used, those basin, furrow, flood irrigation. Why, if they just get with the program, then we'd have enough water left over for everybody else, right? We could transfer all that extra water that they're wasting into some other uses, and everybody would be happy, and we'd all be better off as a result. Well, that's kind of a sense that you hear. I quit cutting out newspaper articles a long time ago, but that's in the Sun News, that's in this article, that article. There are lots of people out there. The environmental community is, many of them, of the opinion that that's the problem, et cetera, et cetera. They're not alone. Well, the big question out there is how much water do our crops consume? We have research in the past. We have current research. We've got some ideas about what the crops consume. We have models. We have past field evidence, et cetera. Remote sensing and the data that uses through the satellite sensing of what's happening on the ground can provide us with very nice broad-scale estimates as to how much water the crops are truly using. We used to have very pinpoint estimates using lysimeters or using other technology, but that's a pretty small scale estimate. With remote sensing, we can get a bigger picture like basin-wide, essentially. So Dr. Samani has developed a model called the Regional ET Estimation Model. It goes by the name REAM. It's been applied crop and riparian vegetation. Samani, Bawazir et al. Have been working on this for several years. It uses energy balance, which is beyond the scope of my presentation. I just like to look at the output that they finally generate. This has been applied to the Mesilla Valley with parcel level estimates of total annual ET. That's the consumptive use of the crop. Pecans, alfalfa, and cotton are the key commodities here that we produce, and those are the ones that Samani et al. Have been working on. We're getting a good handle on the degree of deficit irrigation. From NRCS this morning, the speaker mentioned there's a lot of deficit irrigation here. Well, this research gives us the information as to really how extreme or the levels at which the deficit irrigation is occurring. Okay, this is a similar picture to what Dr. Samani had on his presentation earlier. This is data for the reach through the region of the Mesilla Valley from 2002 on the left, 2003 on the right. Those are total annual accumulated evapotranspiration by the agricultural vegetation, as well as you could pick up some golf courses and things like that in there on the pictures. So that's the raw material, the raw data that are generated by the model. Here is one particular crop. This is this model's estimated average annual evapotranspiration in millimeters. 2002 and 2003 were averaging that for 279 mature full canopy pecan orchards, greater than 10 acres. Looking at a full canopy crop. Now, it is real typical, and I'm an economist, okay? I'm a social scientist, so I'm very different from others. But, you know, agronomists love to point, whoops, go back here. Agronomists love to point to that little area right out there and say that's where you need to be. That's where you need to be producing. That's where the level of water use that you need to be optimizing your production and the yield that will be forthcoming from using water at that level. So that's kind of the target from that particular discipline's perspective. But what we know is that from economic decision making, from that standpoint, is that people usually don't try to push for maximum production. And there's lots of good reasons. I mean, rarely is it economically rational to be trying to push out to maximize your production because resources aren't free. And we have to consider the opportunity cost of those resources, balance the use of them, balance the use of our time and everything else. But we've generated, and the Samani et al. Have generated figures like that for all the major crops produced in this region. And what you see is that the normal distribution of water use is very, very typical. And we have a situation here. This is a number of pecan orchards. There's 279 of them. Annual ET over the year, and it looks real normal, normally distributed. So you have a small number of orchards, which are adding here at this very high level of water use. And you have a lot of them that really aren't there. And yeah, again, these are full canopy orchards, and yet they're consuming water. Actual depletion of water is at these very low levels. Now there's a lot of orchards sort of right there in the middle. We've worked on this for other crops and other years. The years I'm going to focus on are 2002 and 2003, which were much more well-watered or a lot more water in the system in those years. But this picture on the left there, that is from 2008. That's the same region here, 2008 total an ET map from that year. And then this figure right here, this is alfalfa. Alfalfa ET, and I can't remember, there are like 600 fields in that distribution there, Samani, right? 400 to 500? Several hundred. But that is the distribution of alfalfa evapotranspiration. And again, it's normally distributed. There's a lot of reasons why. Alfalfa, of course, is multiple harvesting throughout the growing season, and that impacts the level of water use. It's real hard to max out alfalfa ET when you're in the process of harvesting repeatedly throughout the growing season. Okay, moving right along. Well, we looked at these data and we thought, what can we say with respect to yields, nut yields, and water use? And there are different ways, different methods over the years that economists and engineering people have tried to develop this relationship between water use and yield, the crop outcome at the end of the growing season. Water production functions is kind of the general heading. Some of those water production functions deal with applied water. Others deal with the ET. As we know more about actual crop consumptive use, what is the relationship there between yield and the consumptive use? So I've worked on this for a couple of years now and continue to work on it. Hopefully we'll get something published on this before too long. But we've developed a yield ET production function using fairly limited data, which you'll see why in just a second. So we have parcel level, field level consumptive use of the water, 279 mature orchards. Now it is very, very difficult to obtain yield data because people don't like to disclose their yield data because it's basically saying, how much money did you earn from the crop that you produced? And it's really uncomfortable to go around and ask that question from an economist standpoint. I grew up on a farm and I know we didn't like people asking us, how many acres, what was your yield, and boy, they have a good handle on how much income you earned. So reliable yield data are not readily available. But we did obtain some estimates from a small number of producers, and they were cooperative with us, and we managed to get some data, and their data are not disclosed as individuals here, but you can see where we're coming from. So my figure up there on the left shows a very, very simple linear relationship that we have developed that is yield, kilograms per hectare, as a function of ET. And it's a little simple line, and those are our farms, our observed farms are the dots on that relationship. We can explain about 82% of yield, the reported yields what these growers gave us, based on consumptive use of water. So that's one of the management factors, but clearly it's a real important management factor here in this region. Figure 2 on the bottom right is a little different, and it puts things in relative terms because it's real common in the plant water use, plant water relationship literature to see things put in terms of relative ET versus relative yield. It's the same equation essentially. Again, we're explaining 82%. It's just different mathematics behind it. But you're looking down here at the actual ET as a percentage of the maximum ET, which we found in our data, and then the actual yields as a percentage of maximum. And you can see if you go out here, you look at about 80% of ET will give you about 60% of the relative yield, or 60% of the yield. So that's kind of the raw material that we start with here. And of course, it would be nice, and we have made attempts to get more data to put into these relationships, but we've had a hard time coming up with years and observations for which we can actually match the ET data with the yield data for 2 years in a row, because with an alternate bearing crop that makes it a little bit more complicated than a straight crop. So the interpretation of the yield ET function. Well, yields are reduced because of the ET deficit, clearly. Almost all orchards are deficit irrigated. I'd say they probably, I would almost be willing to say all orchards are deficit irrigated, but I probably should hedge it a little bit and say almost all. So there's a very, very high level of deficit irrigation here. The crops are not getting all of the water and able to use all of the water that they could use to potential. And so yields are therefore significantly less than potential yields from an agronomic maximum sense, a standpoint. That if we had more water being put on these crops and they could effectively use that water successfully, bring it into the crop's physiology, the evapotranspiration process, then we would have much higher yields as a result. So full irrigation, if we consider the full irrigation what we have seen, although that's sort of our marker of full irrigation, it could be higher out there in the real world if some additional constraints didn't exist. But full irrigation would increase total production, maybe about 40% based on the calculations that we're having here. Gross revenues would increase, et cetera. Pecan consumptive use or depletion, however, would also increase in line with that relationship between, that is a strong relationship that we can illustrate that shows, more consumptive use equals more yield, more crop. Well, implications. Almost all pecan orchards are not irrigated at or near potential ET, and we could say the same thing definitely for alfalfa as a crop here, which is an economically important crop, a crop that is, I would say, critical, or it's an important input into the local dairy industry. Those fields are not irrigated at or near potential ET either. But if they were, we would have much higher yields, but we would also have a much higher level of depletion, right? More consumptive use. Now, improvements in the irrigation infrastructure and technology are very, very likely to increase depletions. If we were to do a generally overall better job of getting water to the crops when the crops really needed it, when they could use it, when they could turn it into yield, then depletion or consumptive use would increase. So there's a trade-off there. Many, many reasons why production is less than potential. We've thought about this, brainstormed about this, looked at the different production cultural practices between the crops, orchards versus a perennial alfalfa, et cetera. There's a lot of reasons why, and it makes a lot of sense. Because the current operating and the structural limitations of the irrigation system just make it that that's the way it's going to be. Surface water quality is one of those limitations as well. If you had a perfect system where you could perfectly get the water to the plant's roots at the exact right time when it needed the water, you would have a very, very different kind of operating system and the ability to deliver and get the water there at that point in time. It takes instantaneous irrigation in order to basically get up to those maximum ETs and maximum potential yields. And also, I look at this as a social scientist, and I can see, and I've done a lot of field visits and observations within the Elephant Butte Irrigation District. A lot of producers, people who have the smaller orchards, and not necessarily smaller ones, but some bigger ones as well. They're not totally dependent upon pecan production for their livelihood, for their household income. So the idea that they are going to be, really intense managers and do everything in the most timely fashion that needs to be done during the course of a growing season, they're less likely to do that than a lot of managers. So irrigation systems and practices, basically there's a lot of status quo that makes a lot of sense given the population of irrigators. We also see little investment in new on-farm technology that would help to get the water to the plant exactly when the plant needs it. And some of that has to do with the nature of the fragmentation of the irrigation land, the irrigated land in this region, because you've got subdivisions and the delivery system has a hard time doing what it needs to do. Speculation and impermanence syndrome when you're looking at around the urbanizing areas. Why should I make a big investment in a fixed irrigation system and new technology when I'm thinking in the future, or my children are thinking in the future, that this is going to be turned into rural residential subdivisions? And there's a lot of good common sense decision making. Also, from what we see, the common property nature of some of the parts of the irrigation system, parts that are not maintained by the district, that's also an obstacle toward timely delivery of the water in some locations. But essentially, we're looking at economically rational decision making. Maximum yields are rarely economically optimal. If all your resources are free, you would say, yeah, that makes sense. But from an economic standpoint, we look at it very, very differently than, say, the agronomists who focus on the max, no matter what. And also, from an engineering standpoint, delivery systems get designed for maximum yields, for maximum potential ET, and that may make sense to design it like that, but that doesn't necessarily mean that that is going to jive with the actual producer's decision making on the grounds and the kind of constraints that they have to deal with. Well, when we look at this from a water use efficiency standpoint, and the nature of this little curve up there is a function of the little equation that I showed earlier. But this is on my horizontal axis, percent of full irrigation, going from 0 to 100%, and then kilograms per cubic meter on the vertical axis. There's a big question out there internationally in irrigation science, and it looks at crop per drop. We've got to get more crop per drop. We've got to get better at what we're doing with the use of our irrigation water, in large part because we've got growing populations worldwide. We need to have more calories per person for development and human sustenance. So crop per drop is the criteria that we oftentimes use. And you see that in all the literature all over the place, internationally, everywhere from India to the US to Brazil and everything in between. So what I show here is that this is crop per drop, essentially. And that's mathematically related to the equation that I had. And we could argue about the shape that form ought to take, that equation ought to take. We could argue that it would change if I had more data, and it very well could. But what we see here is, okay, water use efficiency, the relationship between yield and ET. Water use efficiency is highest at the highest levels of irrigation, or where we are most doing the best job of satisfying the plant's water use needs, or getting closest to the potential water use that plant could actually do in an unlimited resource environment. So from a crop per drop standpoint, you're getting the most water that you're using. So we have to go back here to some questions that I raised earlier, the way I started this. Should policies, programs, and planning be based on theoretical water use, or should they be based on what people actually do and what is actually feasible? Because the theoretical water use is going to put you way out there on the right-hand side of the distribution, and if that's your target, you're really going to be using a lot more water. Now, conservation is in the eye of the beholder. Some people, I like to say, and others say, it's kind of like pornography. You know it when you see it. Environmentalists have very, very different views and opinions as to what constitutes water conservation than do farmers. From a farm perspective, that means usually turning it into yield. And we could say here that the people that use the most water are generating the most yield. So therefore, by that definition, from a farmer perspective definition, they're conserving the water because they are turning it into yield. All right, given our irrigation infrastructure limitations, and I say pecan producers' constraints, but you could say alfalfa producers' constraints or anybody else's, what ET and what yields are actually feasible? What should our realistic perspective on the system be? Now, policies and programs oftentimes seek to increase depletion. And there are some particular basins in the United States that have been dealing with this question, and like one up in Colorado, for example, they've actually, state engineers become very concerned over the last several years because water-saving technologies being adopted in those irrigated areas are essentially impacting downstream deliveries because the depletion, the consumptive use locally is increasing, which freaks out the state engineers when you have particular interstate issues or international issues. So what are the downstream effects? Well, the other thing here is, I went back to that point at the beginning, a lot of people get really freaked out about agriculture wasting water. Based on the results that I have presented here, does it look like agriculture wastes water? No. If your problem with agriculture is that it uses water, period, then you might say, yeah, it's a waste of water. But if you look at the level of deficit irrigation, the degree to which these crops produced here locally are produced under pretty scant water conditions, you could say, no, they're doing a really good job of turning water into yield. More water would be more yield, which would be more use. And that raises the policy question right there. Is that a good idea? So I go back to that, does irrigation waste water? I'm going to say no, it doesn't, but that is in the eye of the beholder.
The challenge there is in who's defining the waste.
That's right, and that is who defines the waste and whose voice is the loudest and who gets the most attention and et cetera, et cetera.
And I think it goes back to, and this is something that's been ongoing for 3,000 years, farmers versus inhabitants of urbanized areas. People in the cities use Phoenix as an example. They think that all the water should go into the city of Phoenix, regardless of its source. They don't care that much about the farmers. And they want to take water from the Colorado River and from the Wyoming and everywhere else to take care of them. Los Angeles is another example.
Right. The entire western U.S. has been dealing with these issues for a lot longer than we have probably in this region. Anyway, there's my acknowledgments. There's a lot of resources that have gone into this research, and Dr. Samani's here to answer questions about the specific model, for example, the use of the remote sensing in irrigation understanding, period.
I noticed that part of your research, or that part of it was on larger than 10 acres.
Right.
Have you looked at any of the small acre, for example, the 1 acre plots, to see how do they compare?
Well, I'll just say something to that, and maybe you can add to it, Samani, but when you're dealing with the remote sensing technology, you're taking a picture from way up there, the Landsat picture, and it becomes very, very difficult on the smaller parcels to be able to draw your boundaries. You have the edge effects, and it's real difficult to confine your data, confine your estimates onto particular parcels. So I think he goes down to about 10 acres. Have you tried to go smaller than that?
No, factor resolution is not high enough to go to 1 acre. So the best you can do is 10 acres.
And that might get better in the future. Yeah, that could get better.
Future is better. You get more precise resolution.
But I do have to say that from a standpoint coming in this as a social scientist and working with engineers and trying to look at some of the economic implications, our big problem at this point has been being able to match the remotely sensed estimates of water use with other things happening on the ground. And the key thing in there is the yield, the data as to what people are actually getting off of their fields. And as I said, that's a touchy question to have to address and ask. It's uncomfortable to ask that question. Also, if we had data, if we had some on-farm insight from a selection of farms as to more of the cultural practices that are going on, you know, the pruning and the fertilization and alfalfa harvesting schedules, et cetera, that would also enrich this and give us much more information about, in particular, when to optimally time your deficit irrigation. Because all these, you know, throughout the growing season, in particular with pecans, a deficit at one time of the year is not going to have the yield impact that a deficit at another time of the year will have. And so we need much more information, robust information about what's going on these particular parcels. But that would get down to some real personal information, and we need volunteers if you're willing to share with us. Question up here in the front, too. Somebody else.
Is there a way of determining if you're putting on more water than is required for full irrigation?
This is something that this data has nothing in here about applied water. There's nothing about applied water. You may be looking at on-farm water application efficiencies of 90%, or they may be at 40 or 50%. We don't know. All this is saying is what has been used effectively by the plant in evapotranspiration. Yeah.
Have you been able to compare this to other pecan growing areas, for example, Georgia and Texas?
No, you have not. No, that's a good question, but we have not.
We have to have a problem doing it, data to figure out what's going on.
And part of the issue too, and correct me if I'm wrong, but we have some benefit here in this region for using the remotely sensed data because of the percentage of cloud-free days that we have. But if you get in areas where you got a lot more atmospheric cloudiness and whatever, that's going to really mess with your ability to come up with these estimates over the course of an entire growing season and say that you have a small error, basically. You're going to get a much bigger error.
You can talk to USDA and ask them to provide you some help.
There's a lot of public domain satellite data at this point. But again, the problem is you get in and you look at the data and there's a big old cloud just exactly when you wanted to have an estimate of what was going on the ground. And we have had trouble getting yield data for the same years that we have good satellite pictures. For instance, I have some yield data that I haven't been able to use because we don't have satellite pictures for those months, for those years. Okay, any other questions?
Thank you.
So next time you see one of those newspaper articles that says if farmers would just get with the program and go with these different technologies.
The preceding was a production of New Mexico State University. The views and opinions in this program are those of the author and do not necessarily represent the views and opinions of the NMSU Board of Regents.